Around the tail end of 2019, Google offered to the world an experience known simply as Stadia, a cloud gaming system that boasted a whole library of games to play on your TV and smart devices without the bulkiness of your regular console. Gamers were excited, especially Twitch streamers. At last, the world welcomed Stadia with open arms, and
this sucks more than anything that has ever sucked before.
It bombed. Big time. This absolutely terrible launch really highlighted Google's poor marketing. It barely explained how to get the Stadia working properly, and instead, all we got was this really bizarre, misleading commercial that kinda dunks too much on other console gaming options. And that's not even getting into the controversies with streamers. Not only did you have to jump through more hoops than usual to get it working, but get this. The creative director for Google Stadia, Alex Hutchinson, said that people who stream video games, and I quote, should be paying the developers and publishers of the games they stream.
You're an idiot.
Surrounding circumstances aside, let's look at the system itself. That library of titles, really limited, and you have to buy. So when the Jaguar proclaimed itself to be 64-bit, it was a pretty big deal. Was it truly 64-bit? Well, the answer is debatable. Some claimed it wasn't actually 64-bit, just two 32-bit processors working in parallel. One thing's for sure, Atari was so confident in it, they made it into a slogan. As for the games, there were a lot of issues. While there were some worth playing, most of them weren't. This is due to a lack of third-party support, which was due to the games being difficult to program. Though, good luck trying to play any of them with this monstrosity of a controller. Atari's really bad at those now that I think about it. On a side note, the Jaguar really got screwed when it came to overseas markets. It took Atari forever to release it to all of Europe. Germany didn't get it immediately, and Spain got it 2 years later, on April 1st.
Not joking. No pun intended.
Of course, Europe was downright lucky compared to Australia. In 1993, USD to Australia was around 1.5. If there were no tariffs, it would be 375 Australian dollars. But there were tariffs, and they raised it by an additional 325 Australian dollars. In 1993, for Americans, that would have been a $217 tariff. Adjusted for inflation, that's basically paying $401 extra for a garbage excuse of a console. Did I do the math, Atari?
Nobody said the math!
On top of all that, we have the CD add-on. Throughout gaming history, console add-ons have seen mixed results, especially when you try to give an add-on to an already struggling console. Given the Jaguar wasn't that great of a system, I'm pretty sure you can figure out how this went. Toilet jokes aside, the Jaguar CD was a mess. Due to a cavalcade of hardware issues, mostly coming from the processors, trying to get one of these to work was an endeavor. Not that there was really much point, given that there were somehow even fewer games on it. Bottom line, the Jaguar failed at nearly every turn. It was intended to bring Atari into the modern era. Sadly, all it did was just toss it into the toilet. The founder of EA, Trip Hawkins, stepped down as EA's CEO, and the 3DO was created through a child company, the aptly named 3DO Company. However, Hawkins was still serving as EA chair at the time. Does that count as this being EA's console? Well, as long as I get a pick on EA, I'm saying yes. So what's so bad about the 3DO that gets it on this list? Well, it'd be easier to list what isn't wrong. Point the first, bad console design. Let's face it, humans are vain creatures, and aesthetics can and do make a difference. The 3DO looks like an ancient VHS player. I know people joke about calling the Xbox Series X a brick, but this is just ridiculous. Point the second, price. Yeah, you know you can get a brand new PS5 with a disc player that will set you back about $500 or so? Assuming you can get one? A brand new 3DO was asking $700 in 1993. Adjusting for inflation, that's a little over $1,300. Yeah, I don't know what they were smoking either. Point the third, marketing. Did you know the 3DO is actually 9 different consoles produced by 4 different manufacturers? And that each 3DO's availability was determined based on your location? And that each 3DO had different specs? No? Me neither, until everyone in the writing team did research for this entry. There was also a promised online function that never came to be. The only redeeming feature of this mess of marketing is that none of the consoles were region locked or had copy protection. Of course, that also made it much easier for hackers to homebrew the 3DOs to high heaven, but it could have been much worse. Point the fourth, hardware. You know, for a time, the hardware on the 3DO that the world was presented, the Panasonic FZ1, was actually pretty advanced. However, this doesn't save it from some absolutely boneheaded choices. You know how PS2 only has 2 controller ports, but you can get splitters you can put into the ports so you can have up to 8 people playing? Well, someone on the 3DO team thought it would be a good idea to have a single controller port and then have additional controllers connect directly to the first controller. Point the fifth, games library. A console can be the greatest thing since sliced bread, but if there's nothing to play on it, then it's just a lump of plastic. Unfortunately for the 3DO, it launched with only a single game, and its library didn't expand in leaps and bounds from there. The console has a pathetically shallow pool of exclusives, and even its list of ported games isn't exactly the Marianas Trench of possibility. Adding on a liberal license policy that allowed games like Plumbers Don't Wear Ties to exist and be sold on the thing, there really wasn't much reason to have this console. Ultimately, the 3DO was a misguided concept from the start. From a troubled production to some baffling choices in hardware and a couple gimmicks that were pretty worthless, the 3DO just faded into obscurity almost as soon as it was born. RIP 3DO. The Sega CD is supposed to be Sega's way of taking a step forward with game consoles, with games running via discs instead of cartridges. While it's not a bad direction, since consoles afterwards did adapt to it, it still runs the issue of complicating the Sega Genesis by being an add-on that doesn't provide you with many worthwhile games. Most of its library is just FMV games with choppy visuals and non-existent gameplay. Even with the few games that hold up, is it really worth paying for a console this expensive, especially when its tech doesn't even age that well anymore? Not really. Oh, but that's just scratching the surface. Following up is the 32X, yet another console extension with barely any good games to show. What it does have to show is a million power adapters to plug in just to get it to work. Oh, and guess what? It costs a lot too. So add this alongside the Sega CD on top of games made to be exclusively played with both add-ons, and you're paying over $550 worth of console price with an inflation of over $970. That's like paying $800 for 2 separate 360 plus add-ons nowadays. Adding insult to injury, 32X is what the US gets as their exclusive console when Japan already has a martial artist beating them over the head. So while the US has to wait 6 months for Saturn, all they can do is build an iron lung for the Genesis and watch it slowly get crushed under its own weight.
Man, we were chipped.
First time.
And it didn't stop there either. There's even the canceled system Neptune, which was originally planned to be a standalone console for 32X. A little confusing, given that 32X was originally codenamed Project Mars, and oh gosh, this is getting a little hard to follow. Looking at what Sega did to their classic console was depressing. The whole thing was one miserable decision after another that ultimately led to the company's financial crisis and pulled it out of the console scene entirely. At least it does serve as a cautionary tale for future console markets to focus on the importance of user-friendly products. Yeah, the attempts at gimmicks are still there, but man, could they have done much worse. The 5200 fell flat. What really didn't help was that it came out during the video game crash of 1983. Yeah, remember that? Where the gaming industry took a financial downturn thanks to really, really bad games?
It's a crash! The entire world economy is destroyed!
Of course, the real issues came from the console itself. For starters, look at this thing. It's enormous and bulky. It looks more like a fax machine than a gaming console. Don't get me started on the controller. It was incredibly fragile, really uncomfortable to handle, and it looked more like an old school cell phone with a pause button?
All my life, leading up to this moment.
Later.
Okay, joking aside, the pause button was a genuinely new thing at the time, so that's one good thing about this controller. out of literally nothing else. Other than that, there were also complaints about how the 5200's games were just enhanced versions of its predecessor's titles, and it couldn't play the actual games without an adapter. While it didn't have heavy competition, only going up against Intellivision and ColecoVision, it only managed barely over 1 million sales at $269 for at least 2 years. On the plus side, the outdated 2600 continued to thrive until the 90s, and Atari was a lot more careful with the 7800, with actual backward compatibility, while the 5200 is just a product of bad timing, little effort, and really confusing design choices. Get to the point and talk about the Ouya. The Ouya was an Android microconsole released originally in 2013 after a successful Kickstarter campaign that raised over $8 million in 2012. Unfortunately, like a good number of Kickstarter campaigns, what was promised and what was given were two different realities. The console on its own was honestly not that bad. It worked for the most part, but there were some issues. Those being poor connectability with the internet,
Oh, no.
a subpar controller with input lag, oh no, and a poor performance of mobile games compared to when played on mobile.
Oh yeah!
Unfortunately, those three things are all very important items needed to make a good console. The other thing needed was games, which the Ouya was pretty light on to begin with. To balance that, Ouya Incorporated created the Free the Games Fund, which helped budding developers with funding by matching indie crowdfunding campaigns up to $50,000 as long as the game was Ouya exclusive for the first 6 months. But that didn't do much when the first 2 games successful with this program had reports of people artificially inflating their campaigns to gain additional funding from Ouya. Because of course, whenever someone tries to help the little guy, people always try to find a way to abuse it. While Ouya did fix these issues with the fund, it didn't help their gaming catalog that much. So despite the Kickstarter, the console itself only sold 200,000 units and was deemed a commercial failure. In 2015, the console itself was discontinued and its assets and staff were sold to Razer, who eventually killed the Ouya completely in 2019. This is kind of unfortunate since the Ouya actually had a good premise with a way to make gaming accessible and cheap, and that anyone can make a game for the system without a license. Kind of like Steam Greenlight, or the Atari 2600, or the 3DO. Okay, maybe not that good. Nevertheless, when compared to the juggernauts that were the big 3 console developers and how mobile gaming was already starting to get way better with the release of the iPad and Android tablets, there was no reason to choose a home console that played mobile games worse than a portable phone that was better in performance and accessibility.